Ed, in previous sessions, we have touched on Whitman's use of the catalog. We know that he's drawing on a long tradition, beginning with Homer's catalogs of the ships. Today, we might look at it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, for this session, we've been reading in the later part of the poems, sections 47 through 49. And by the time we get this far into the poem, we're so used to Whitman's catalogs that we almost don't even notice when they're there. In section 47, for instance, we get a kind of last little catalog. The young mechanic is closest to me, he knows me well. The woodman that takes his axe and jug with him shall take me with him all day. The farm boy plowing in the field feels good at the sound of my voice. And it goes on with, again, in that form that we've now internalized and just really gotten used to. One line, one image. One line, one image.
One breath.
One breath, yeah. It's as Whitman has that image of my head slewing around on my neck. You know, it's as if those catalogs are the head just moving, and whatever the eyes and the ears pick up becomes a line in the poem. And so as we come toward the end of the poem, we think back on how strange those catalogs felt. Section 15, where we got our first extended catalog, and then section 33, where it goes on for pages and pages and pages, the longest section of the poem. And I love thinking about how early readers responded to this. So many of the early reviews of Leaves of Grass complained about Whitman's poetry sounding like an auctioneer's catalog. You know, that Whitman was some auctioneer just auctioning off the world because it was one item after another after another. And it gives you the sense that up to that point, there really had been nothing quite like it in American poetry. We have the Homeric catalogs, obviously, we've got biblical catalogs, but this kind of catalog of the commonplace, this catalog of just things that you see around you, there had never been anything quite like it before.
So how do we read these catalogs? How does Whitman want us to read these catalogs?
That's a great question. Whitman came to call them catalogs himself, picking up on the early criticism.
An early review.
Yeah, picking up on those early reviews, just saying, okay, people want to call them my catalogs, I'll call them catalogs, that's fine with me. But we really don't know how Whitman himself would have wanted us to read them. I've noticed over the years that my students will very often say, when they come to the catalog sections, 15 and 33 in the poems, they slow down more than at any other point in Song of Myself. That it makes them really slow down and savor image by image. But I've had other students who will say, this is when I really speed up. Yeah. I just start skimming through the catalogs. Because you kind of get the point and you can just kind of move through them. You can read them as if you're on a train and the train's moving quickly, and through the window you're seeing sort of flashes of continually different scenes. Or you can read them the way I think William Carlos Williams would have taught us to read them. Williams, when he read Whitman's catalogs, said, well, Whitman's problem was that he didn't see the number of poems that he had in that one poem. For Williams, it would be, let's slow this catalog down and turn each one into a poem. I think of Williams' triadic line, and if we take the famous Red Wheelbarrow poem and take the opening of that, So Much Depends Upon, and put that in front of every line of a Whitman catalog, you begin to get the sense of how Williams would say, everything in the world obviously depends upon this one thing that is in our sight, in our hearing, at that particular moment. That's what life depends on.
So it's as if Whitman is laying out a grid for all future poets in which they will work. Here's one way to take a look at the world. Take each one of those lines, turn it into a poem, and you become William Carlos Williams.
That's right. That's right. Ezra Pound saying about Whitman that he broke the new wood, and now is the time for carving. Right. That there was a kind of brute democratic power to what Whitman did to in these catalogs just pull together a sort of representative randomness of the world and make it appear as poetry. And then what the modernists needed to do, Pound said, was begin to work with the things he'd chopped down and turn them into the true sculptures.
Yeah. It also touches on issues that we've addressed earlier in earlier sessions about his love of photography, doesn't it? The way that the photograph can give you every part of the landscape, all the debris, all the clutter, everything that makes up this world of ours.
Absolutely, and you really do get the sense in the catalogs more than anywhere else of that poetic page as a kind of open photographic plate, a kind of blank photographic plate on which anything can take its place. And so you get on those pages of catalogs a wild sense of randomness, and the power is in that randomness. It appears random to us, but of course Whitman was continually working and working to get the lines in the order that, for whatever reason, he felt worked best.
Do you have a sense of what that ordering process might have been for him?
I don't really have a sense of it. I think in section 33, section 15, there are recurring motifs, recurring images, so that you'll get musical sounds, for instance.
So it comes back in a refrain-like manner.
Yeah, it just there'll be a jingle of change, and then there'll be a whistle of a train, and so you'll get a sense that it's not mathematical by any means, but a sense that every once in a while there needs to be a sound to make the world feel properly represented in these catalogs. Every once in a while there needs to be a young woman. Every once in a while there needs to be a young man. Every once in a while there needs to be a rural scene. There needs to be an urban scene. So I think Whitman is at some level in these catalogs looking for how the randomness, the apparent randomness of the representation still has to be representative. So he's looking to make sure there's the proper balance of the elements. I'm always struck as I read the catalogs with the way that Whitman creates for himself a new pattern of hearing and thinking his way through poetry.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he gives up right margin rhyme, for instance. Okay. Very few Whitman poems in Leaves of Grass have right margin rhyme. Occasionally they do. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," famously, but in Whitman, when there's right margin rhyme, when two lines rhyme at the right margin, it draws attention to itself because of its rarity, rather than in poets who normally rhyme. Lines draw attention to themselves when the rhyme fails. In Whitman, it's when the rhyme hits that our attention's drawn to it. In the catalogs and in so much of his other poetry, he rhymes really at the left-hand margin, and he rhymes by anaphora, by the repetition of the same word, so that we sort of soar out through the line, and then we always come back to a sound that we're familiar with at the beginning of the line that immediately is already taking us out again into the world, into another part of the world we didn't expect to go to.
And with the repetition of that sound at the beginning of the line can extend for however long the poet wants. And in that surging rhythm, we find the variation that is at the heart of poetry, right?
That's right.
We have a regular anaphora and then the surge.
That's right. So that we're continually moving out, and instead of resting at the end of a perception, we come to just this tiny moment's rest at the beginning of the next perception. We're already there. So it's a style that keeps the reader moving, never at rest, always moving. The moment of rest is the moment already of moving again into the next line. And those repetitions so often in the catalogs are the definite articles, the thes. And I always think about how different Whitman's catalogs would feel if he used the indefinite article, if he used an instead of a the. Because the allows for a specificity of this particular image. It's the hunter, right? But the is also generic. It's the hunter, right? So we get a specific hunter as well as the generic hunter in the catalog. And in the catalog, as we move through that wild diversity of imagery, we're seeing specific things all the time, but we're also seeing the way the world is. All over the world, there's a hunter hunting right now.
And it brings to mind one of Whitman's great descendants, Wallace Stevens, who concludes his marvelous poem, The Man on the Dump, with that line, "Where was it one first heard of the truth? The definite article." And it seems like a perfect Whitmanic line, isn't it?
It does indeed.